bullet didn't actually lodge in her, it just sort of scraped past her, or at least that was like the take that I took on it. And she was rescued by some sailors, and she comes back to haunt him. Obviously, Grand Guignol has nothing to do with ghosts or vampires or anything like that. It's very realistic, but it plays on the fear that a lot of people had back then of the paranormal. So she comes back and essentially tortures him, like mentally, not physically. She doesn't actually sort of touch him or hug him or anything, apart from she kisses his finger, and psychosomatically he gets an extreme amount of pain from this finger, and that's where the play begins. He comes to a hospital ward and he asks to have it cut off, and the doctor won't do it because he thinks that he's just being a bit crazy, and he actually ends up just grabbing the scalpel himself and doing it. That was a challenge special effects wise. It had a lot to do with interesting staging. Sort of, obviously we had to have the man sort of faced away from the audience, and it was a challenge to do stuff like that. We actually had to change the ending because of special effects, but that's where the scene ends. And Act 2, it's in this gentleman's house, and the doctor comes around to check on him. Everything seems to be all okay. Turns around that the wife is still haunting him, and then makes her husband fiance cut off his entire hand, as it's the hand that shot her. I need to get genders right. It's the hand that shot her. So that sort of gets interrupted at the very end. The doctor and his assistant sort of burst in, and they realise that she's a fake, and it all sort of ends. In the original, he grabs an axe and chops his hand off. Unfortunately, we didn't have the funding at the time for prosthetics, and we didn't have the expertise either. Sort of all of us are quite amateur when we're doing sort of special effects and things like that. We've kind of grown a little bit since then, but we ended up changing it so he grabs a knife instead, but she grabs it off of him and stabs him in the back. So that got changed around, but that's sort of, I guess, the nature of directing a production like this. When they did the original theatre, they were, you know, they had so much expertise in the way of fake blood, in the way of prosthetics, in the way of implements and things, and it's something that we didn't and still don't have, so we've had to change things around. But I'd like to think that we're growing, and the production that we're doing at Halloween is going to be a lot more sort of face-on gore than there was in our original production. So that's Final Kiss. That's not Final Kiss, that's Kiss of Blood. So the final thing we want to talk to you guys about is the challenges that we faced by sticking to the original Grand Guignol traditions and staging it more as a showcase than a sort of not traditional, but like a normal show of today. The original way that they would do a show is they would have what they called a douche écossaise, which is literally translated into a Scottish shower, but it means sort of having different genres thrown at the audience. They're kind of always on their seat. So you'd have a horror and a comedy in one night and all this sort of stuff. So we decided to have 4 plays. So we had Kiss of Blood, Tixall Doing the Deed, Euthanasia, and then Final Kiss. Along with, we had 2 skits in the middle. We had Gigolo, which was at the end of Tixall Doing the Deed, which both of these skits were devised by our actors and one director. And Gigolo, we basically, it was essentially a torture scene, wasn't it? We had one of our willing actors essentially carved up with end of Act 1 written onto his chest. And I'll try and put a photo into here, or up there.
Horribly mutilated.
That. Oh yeah, horribly mutilated, to the sound of Louis Prima's Just a Gigolo. So you kind of, in a sense, also had that mix of emotions just in one skit. We had 3 skits. We had one right at the beginning to get everyone to turn their phones off and be quiet in our production. So we had 2 of our actors, which were James Hardman and Tom Tockley, very loudly talking while one of our directors was trying to sort of explain about the style, and one of them was chloroformed and dragged out while the other one sort of ran to his aid. So we had that, and then we had another one which was written and performed by Olivier Blanc, which was called Sinking, and it was about the feeling of sinking sort of on a ship, and it was really interesting. So we had those, and essentially the way that we spaced it out, you did get this feeling where there was no common theme of the production. Everything was, the audience were constantly on their seat. They didn't know what was coming next, whether it was a comedy, whether it was a horror, whether it was a really sort of harrowing production like Euthanasia was. So that was really interesting, and that was us keeping in the traditions of the old theatre. What troubles did we face?
The troubles with Grand Guignol are kind of the thing which make it unique in the same respects, because the normal and more recognised modern idea of a production is one show, maybe 2 acts, 2 hours, hour and a half long, same show all the way through, different changes, that's fine, but ultimately still the same show. Grand Guignol is like trying to put 3 or 4 different shows together, and the troubles which you would face mostly with that is not just, are the shows going to balance out well, are they going to come in the right order so you get the nice flow of the show, but are they all going to be to the same standard? Are they all going to be able to be consistent with each other? And what we found especially difficult for ours was just a way for balancing all the plays, because obviously we had the 4 plays which were Kiss of Blood, Ticks, Euthanasia, and Final Kiss. Now, all of them have some very strong merits. Some of them are very good. Some of them have go in different directions. Euthanasia, for example, is about the very contemporary argument of assisted suicide. Ticks was our comedy, and Final Kiss is obviously the final revenge. But finding a way to balance things like that is always a big challenge, and it was something which we struggled with. And in the end, the running order was Kiss of Blood, because it was a good opener. It got people really into the style of Grand Guignol, and it really introduced them to what it was all about.
And it was good having the 2-actor at the beginning, because...
Because it meant things that rather than getting to the end and then thinking it was over, but then there was more to it, it stopped that little things like that from happening and breaking up the flow. Then we had Tick second, which was the comedy, the reasonably light-hearted humour, which really kind of brought things to a more light-hearted, more rounded off idea, gave everything a much more comedic feel to it. And then we had our lovely little interval in the middle of it.
But it's still, with Gigolo, you're still left with kind of a light-hearted feel, because it's it could have been perceived as quite dark, I think, unless we had that ending bit with the end of Act 1 carved into his chest, which actually wasn't our idea, it was his idea.
The juxtaposition for the Gigolo scene was the fact that it's a really gruesome scene of someone getting quite nastily mauled and mutilated, but some really light-hearted, quite upbeat music, which you wouldn't expect to see a man being tied to a chair and then viciously and brutally violated with at all, which kept that light-hearted but quite dark feel to it. And then launching it straight back into Act 2, we had Euthanasia, which was probably one of the most harrowing of all the shows we did, and probably the hardest one to actually get right, I'd imagine, for the director, because it's such a big topic, and to do it justice would be very, very difficult in any stance, in any kind of environment.
I think he did it amazingly.
He did it very well.
They did actually change the format of Euthanasia. So the original production, you've got a husband and a wife, and the husband is the one who's suffering, and the argument of assisted suicide is with him. Whereas in our production, our director chose to have 2 sisters, which completely changed the dynamic, but just made it really beautiful, I think. And it took it almost away from relationships, which you'd had in most of the productions. So, yeah. Sorry, random little side note there.
It's alright, but that's the other thing, because it also changes the gender perspective as well, and it almost brings it back to this kind of quite nice family feel. This is, as an observer and spectator, watching this play. I didn't direct it, so I can't comment on it if it was the intention or not. But it had this really nice, quite fraternal feel almost to it. Because, the idea of one sister looking after the other and keeping the family as the centre and doing the best for each other was actually quite a nice feel to it, in spite of this very dark, quite harrowing subject. And that was why Euthanasia was probably one of the ones which really stood out the most, especially for me, even as a director. But with Final Kiss, which was the last one, the idea of revenge complete, similar in a way to Kiss of Blood, but just with a gender swap. So rather than this time the wife coming back to seek her revenge, it was the husband bringing the wife to him to get his final revenge, to get his final kiss, as it was. And the idea of Final Kiss, we were talking about, is that you see characters who aren't good people, who don't have much in the way of good morals or good virtues about them, who are there purely for one purpose, and that is to get their revenge and nothing else. And both those characters in the play, both Jean and Henri, both got their revenge. But it was just the question of the timing, and you see one but you don't see the other, similar to Kiss of Blood. But it also rounded everything off quite nicely, because it ends with, he's got his revenge, and with the lines, it's over, being said again and again, so it rebalances out the showcase, and ended it on a really definite and final note, which we all really, really liked.
Also quite a harrowing note. I'd like to think if my screams were anything to go by.
Yes. Her screams were very harrowing.
It was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was... Yeah, it also, one thing which we found quite a big debate between us was the question to have bows or not. In a production I saw in London, which was Terror 2009, I believe they do it every year in the Southwark Playhouse. It's absolutely amazing. There was, again, 4 productions, a few little skits, which is another place where we really got our inspiration for the layout from. They had no bows at the end, they just left it and the lights go up and it really stayed with you. And we did that for the first night, but unfortunately it didn't really work with the audience that we had, and we kind of felt that it didn't leave it on a definite enough note because we had switched stuff around so much. And I think this time around, if we have a programme or something that's going to say this is the last production, then it would work. But it didn't with our last one, so for the last 2 nights we did have bows. But that's another debate which comes up in Grand Canyon Productions. But I believe that is all we're talking about today.
Yes,
so
that's us done.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you sort of enjoyed this. Like I said earlier, I'm going to put a lot of links in the description. I'm going to put links to the Clive Barker A to Z of Horror, which is really good. It's only a 5-minute clip. I'll put a couple of links to Thrill Peddlers productions of some of the plays which we did, and hopefully